reach to the east, and Iran is in between, then what I'm imagining is an emerging arrangement whereby the One Belt, One Road initiative, enmeshed with Vision 2030, creates a web of economically interdependent relationships from Central Asia across to the Arab Gulf region that make it impossible for the levels of antagonism and diplomatic conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran to go beyond a certain point. There are, of course, wildcard issues that we have to contemplate around the future of the political leadership of Saudi Arabia and Iran in this. I'm not worrying about China. China will do its thing. I'm not worried about the Chinese portion of this. I'm worried about what happens when the current supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, dies and we have a new supreme leader. I'm wondering how the question of Saudi leadership plays out, right? Everyone is watching Mohammed bin Salman right now, but technically he's not the next king. Right. Will his father elevate him above Mohammed bin Nayef to make him the crown prince? We'll see. I think that King Salman already has in mind certain criteria for making that decision, which are based on levels of instability and violence and terrorism in the region. And I think if he senses that things are calming down, he'll be more willing to hand things over to his son. Whereas if the security situation remains very volatile, then he will probably stay with Mohammed bin Nayef, for whom security and terrorism is his main skill set and focus. So I don't have any, I'm not coming here with any precise recommendations or asks, and obviously I'm just an independent academic in the United States at this point. But I'm just, the part of me that reflects on the ways in which macro and cross-regional level changes can have more localized effects, that part of my brain is just thinking a lot about ways that China could potentially have a very positive impact on the Middle East while simultaneously minimizing direct risk to China.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I was very interested in the framework you were mentioning about stabilizing the Middle East, but then you made the metaphor with EU and NATO,
Yes.
which happened to be a economic or military defense
Yes.
system in the beginning.
Yes.
But when they were founded, the conflict of the region was mainly political or economic.
Yes.
But now the conflict in the Middle East seems to be more towards a socio or even ethnic religious conflict. How would you reconcile this difference?
Good question. And let me clarify first that I'm not trying to draw a direct analogy or metaphor between the EU, NATO, and the kinds of frameworks that I have in mind. I'm just using the EU and the NATO as an example of a large institutional framework that exerts a magnetic force that causes countries to constrain their policies and align their policies in a certain direction to allow for participation. So, of course, the circumstances that led to the creation of EU and NATO and the function of those organizations is quite different from what I have in mind. I'm just using them as examples of large institutional frameworks. So the question then is, what kinds of frameworks could be created that would have the necessary effects and perform the kinds of functions that we need to stabilize the Middle East? And this is where I'm, in my own analysis, making a large bet that many of the conflicts today that we talk about as being religious in nature are not, at their root, actually religious and ethnic in nature. For example, we talk a lot about sectarianism. And it's very easy to talk about sectarianism as if this is based on ancient theological hatreds. That Sunni and Shia in the Middle East are still today fighting over who should lead the Muslim community after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, you know. But that's not what is at the root of most sectarian conflict in the Middle East today. And which is why I think when we talk about sectarianism, we have to talk about multiple levels of sectarian tensions, most of which, in my analysis, are political or geopolitical in nature. So in Iraq, for example, Sunnis and Shia are not fighting each other, you know, because of ancient hatred. You know, for most of the 20th century, Sunni and Shia in Iraq were intermarried. It just wasn't that much of an issue. Sectarianism was just not something people thought about or talked about. But underlying that was a certain political reality, which is the fact that since the time of the Ottoman Empire, Iraq had been ruled by a demographic minority, Sunnis. This happened under the Ottomans. This happened in the early monarchic period in Iraq under the early Hashemite kings. This happened under Saddam Hussein. And then what happened because of the American invasion? One of the many bad things that happened because of the American invasion. If you haven't guessed, I was not a fan of the American invasion of Iraq. I'll say that quite openly. Is that almost overnight, we completely inverted the power equation in Iraq, where suddenly a majority population that had been subordinated by a minority population had all of the political power. And that, of course, is just a recipe for increased tension. So when I try to understand what's going on in Iraq, to me, the conflict I look to is actually Northern Ireland, right? Because on the face of it, this was supposed to be a religious conflict. Catholics and Protestants were fighting each other. Were they fighting each other because of differences of theology? Of course not. They were fighting each other about issues of majoritarian and minoritarian access to political power. And so in a place like Iraq, and I would argue even in Syria, a lot of what we see as religious and ethnic tension comes down to differential access to political and economic power that happens to map out along divisions between different groups. There's also a broader sectarian overlay in the region that is a function of the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia. My good friend, one of our think tank analysts in Washington, D.C., Kamran Bukhari, created a very nice term to describe this. He calls it geosectarianism. Right? It's sectarianism that is really a function of geopolitical competition. And what this does is it causes the Saudis to view Shia anywhere in the region as agents of Iran, and to talk against them, and to get members of the Saudi religious establishment to talk against them in religious terms. So that's not to say that religion is irrelevant. It is very relevant in that it provides the vocabulary and it provides tools for pursuing these conflicts. But I believe that at the end of the day, the root of these conflicts is mostly political. And so therefore, if it's political, we know how to solve it. But being able to get to the political heart of the matter sometimes means figuring out how to get past the outward trappings of religious hatred. And so in the short term, when I talk about the need for short-term stabilization measures, that's where I think there is a role for engagement in the realm of religion. The last office I worked at the State Department was actually a brand new office at the State Department that had been created by John Kerry in 2013 that was focused on religion. And it was an office whose function was to figure out how to address the various ways in which religion has an impact on US foreign policy priorities. And so addressing sectarianism in the Middle East was the primary focus of my own work in that office. And so we spent a lot of time dealing with religious leaders and the role that religious leaders can play in helping to turn down the temperatures, the religious temperatures, in order to allow the political negotiations to have more success. But I'm not dismissing the importance of ethnic and religious factors that you raise, because even if, in my view, an objective analysis suggests that the underlying politics is most important, at the level of popular attitudes that are so much the drivers of things like cycles of communal violence, these ideas about ethnic hatred and they are trying to kill us and they are different from us, these ideas have some resonance, and so they are important.
Okay,
So-
I
Last one,
I guess the last question.
one simple question.
Okay.
Can I ask, I know that the different government, different department of the U.S. government is reviewing the impact of the Iranian nuclear deal. So do you have any updates about the review, and what will be the possible scenario after the review?
And would you please introduce yourself?
Okay, Hao Zhou from Caijing Magazine.
From
Caijing Magazine.
I actually have not been, I've been so heavily kind of focused on ISIS, sectarianism, Saudi Arabia stuff that I haven't actually been following. I'm aware that there is a review of the Iranian nuclear deal going on, but I don't actually know what's coming out of it.
But what could be the possible scenario after that, given the Trump's hostility to Iran? So, and also there are some senators are pushing some new sanctions against Iran. So
Yeah.
the review must be very, the result of the review might be negative. So,
Well, I mean, as someone who was speaking with the Obama administration, or working with the Obama administration at the time that the Iranian nuclear deal was negotiated, I feel very confident that it was as effective as possible a arrangement to address the very narrow and specific issue that was in question, which is the nature of Iran's nuclear program. Obviously, in the United States, we do have some members of our Congress that did not support the deal, and who continue to view Iran very skeptically. And so it's certainly possible that they may look to find new forms of sanctions that they can impose on Iran. And so that would necessarily involve the need to make an assessment about the relationship between any new sanctions and the commitments of the United States under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the technical name for the nuclear detail. I just can't comment much more on it because it's not an issue that I've been following very closely.
thank you.
I think we are running time past now 10 now. Okay, thank you, teacher.
No, it's my great
Maybe
pleasure.
I'll conclude. Okay, this is the end of the talk and research. Thank you for sharing your very thinking